All right, all right. Welcome back to the Hyperspace reaction to the Psychedelic Apocalypticism of Terence McKenna by Atun Shei Films. This is day 2 of doing these reactions. Just uploaded the first 3 to YouTube, so those are all now available. As you can see, we've just barely scratched the surface. I expect that this could go for a hot fucking minute. I'm not entirely sure how many parts I plan on doing, if I'm gonna go in as in-depth of commentary for the subsequent part of the video, but we'll see. Time will tell. For YouTube and our TOS overlords, my commentary on this video is based on education and harm reduction. Please don't strike my channel. I hate having to constantly say this, but if I don't, your AI will ban me. So here we are. We're gonna get right into it. So we last left off on introing the kind of backstory to Terence McKenna himself. I felt like that was a good cutoff point, so we'll be getting into that immediately.
Jungle. A priest with a speedboat carried the hippies to an isolated portage.
I'll back it up a little bit so we can get some context.
Action called ukuhe, an ayahuasca-like substance used by the Watoto people indigenous to the La Chorrera municipality of southern Colombia. None of our 4 adventurers could speak a lick of Spanish, so it was highly fortuitous that upon their arrival in South America, they met and befriended Ev, another young Yankee hippie, who tagged along on the expedition as their translator. After days of arduous downriver travel through an increasingly remote landscape of steaming Amazonian jungle, a priest with a...
Hey, I like me some psychedelics and psychonaut experience, but I don't think I would have the physical willpower capacity to do a deep inland Amazonian rainforest trek. That shit sounds awful. I'd like to visit the area at least some point in my life. While I have an international diplomacy degree, I've not really had the opportunity to utilize it. But I do not do well in humid environments, and the Amazon is about as humid as it gets. So their desire to travel there is either one out of pure desperation or pure chaos energy. I feel like a little bit of both as the story unfolds, but you would not catch me staying in the Amazon rainforest for any long amount of time. Holy shit.
Speedboat carried the hippies to an isolated portage, which led to a trail. A 4.5-day hike later, they found themselves in the central village of La Chorrera. A small mission town, La Chorrera's...
Okay, so I'm curious where this actually is located. Oh, you're good on anything. Yeah, you ain't catching me going there. La Chorrera. I wonder if that's simple to spell and I'm not going to look like an idiot. La Chorrera? Colombia. All right, let's get an idea where this is. So, in the flight simulator I like to do, I do a fair bit of flying in this part of the world. Okay, so this is deep, right? So even today, this region of Colombia is like fucked. So you might not appreciate it from like a standard globe or a map, but like this huge chunk of Peru over here, this huge section of Colombia, this section of Venezuela, if you can see it dark on the map, I mean, that it is deeply, deeply uninhabited to this day. The infrastructure is borderline non-existent even to this day, where like, unless you got a fucking boat, unless you're like a bush flying pilot, hence why I like to go there. It's really cool for bush flying. It is shit to get down there, to get anywhere in there. So the idea of doing this decades ago is even more baffling to me. Yeah, the population is largely engaged in agricultural production, hunting, fishing, and banana and cassava growing. Interesting. So another big issue with this region in the Amazon, I feel like I got to integrate history into this as well. Yeah, the main governments, you know, like more coastal governments of Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru historically have been not very great to a lot of the indigenous people deep in the Amazonian rainforest, some of which was basically just slave labor. A lot of these countries have their own sort of like, you see this in Bolivia as well, where there is a big dynamic where there is the mixed or white coastal elite and then the native, typically rural, very impoverished, and there's like a unique racism dynamic there. It's a big problem. So the idea of trying to go there back when Terence did is astonishing from a logistical standpoint, let alone like a geopolitical. Oh, we got the shrimp again. You want some quick shrimp? Ooh. Quick, casual, lo-fi shrimp music. Oh. Okay.
Demographics in the early 70s consisted of a few Spanish-speaking priests and a majority indigenous population of subsistence farmers.
Pretty much.
In the late 19th and early 20th century, the town had been the base of operations for the Peruvian Amazon Company, a rubber corporation.
Ooh, I guess I didn't remember that he went into this much detail in the subject. Okay, yeah, I get it. Homie did his research. It's been a hot minute since I've seen this.
Which conducted slave raids into the surrounding jungle.
Okay.
Forcing the captives to harvest rubber trees en masse in appalling conditions. Indigenous people who resisted were tortured.
It's often described as being incredibly similar to what was done in the Congo. Wow, my Canada Dry ginger ale just made a loud hissing sound, and I thought my computer was on fire. No, so the situation in the Congo under like the what was it? The Belgian king. I don't remember his name. Not important, but it like terrible, like worse than slave conditions. A lot of the rubber plantations or deep inland plantations in South America were often described in similar ways. Truly abhorrent.
Raped and murdered. According to the locals Terence encountered on his journey, this for-profit genocide had reduced the Watoto population from 40,000 down to 5,000. In true hallucinations, Terence lingers on this grisly history, and even relates in detail his encounter with a notorious Barbadian corporate enforcer who helped commit these atrocities, by then hobbled and old, having never been brought to justice for his crimes. But Terence also seems blissfully unaware of the colonial adventurism inherent to his rendering of the tale. At times it reads like Robinson Crusoe. He portrays himself and his companions as explorers of unknown frontiers, both psychic and geographic. This is a pursuit of knowledge, yeah, but it's more romantic than it is empirical, more akin to Magellan than Darwin. And soon enough, the human locals are quickly forgotten.
Yeah, so I feel like that's a very important point to raise. The like, so much of this subject and a lot of this era in studying psychedelics is just marred in a sort of like weird mystical colonialism. It's just very strange. It gives off almost like Dances with Wolves white savior energy. I can't say that Terence necessarily like embodies that. I don't know nearly enough about him as an individual, but like again from a political perspective and international, Indiana Jones vibes. It's well, keep in mind, like a big part of Indiana Jones was who is the person that who was he fighting against? Yeah, the Nazis, and what were they doing? Yeah, imperialism. They were trying to like discover remnants of this old Aryan race, old civilization. They had like this big idea of like a subterranean civilization that was like the real gods. Like complicated story for a different time, but it has that kind of energy. And the part that makes it complicated is like it's kind of interesting in a way, you know, like the whole like fish out of water, like just a college guy goes into the Amazon rainforest. I mean, it's metal as fuck, but it does have some problematic undertones. So like I don't feel like you have to like besmirch the entire subject like, oh well, it's got colonial vibes, you know, we can't appreciate. I think it's just being more aware of that context and keeping that in mind when you consider these things, that, you know, both can be true. There is nuance there.
And La Chorrera's fungal denizens take center stage. A day after their arrival, Dave was exploring the cow pasture behind the house where they were staying. There he found an enormous number of cow pies, and out of each pile of dung sprouted a flush of juicy golden mushrooms. Terence and Dennis quickly identified the species as Psilocybe cubensis, the pan-tropical fungus most commonly found growing in bovine feces. That night, each member of the party consumed 6 of these mushrooms, having really...
Yeah, so I know that that's pretty typical, but I've not... My specialty's been mostly in the synthetic stuff. I've not spent nearly as much time researching the real deal, but it is very fascinating from like a sort of like almost like romanticized idea. Like, isn't it deeply ironic how these deeply powerful and influential forces that kind of bring you to awareness of the true nature of the universe, you know, like everything is ebbing and flowing, there is no consistency, everything that was part of one thing is part of another. These mushrooms literally are shit eaters. I just, it's very funny poetically. Most of the most potent of these types of mushrooms almost explicitly require like very particular decaying matter that's like derived from feces, typically cows, horses, shit that like literally shit that comes from animals that mostly eat grass or other types of things. Ironic or interesting subject. Obviously, there are certainly some of the psilocybin mushrooms that don't explicitly require shit, but it does seem like most of them does.
No good idea of appropriate psilocybin dosage. Terence recorded his thoughts about his first high-dose mushroom trip in his journal the next day.
Multifaceted and benevolent, as complex as mescaline, as intense as LSD, the mushroom, as it is said of peyote, teaches the right way to live. This particular mushroom species is unclaimed, as far as I know, by any Aboriginal people anywhere, and thus is neutral ground for the tryptamine dimension we are exploring.
Not sure how I feel about that one. Unclaimed. That's one of those, like, can you say it's unclaimed when the knowledge of Amazonian tribes to this day is borderline non-existent? Like, can you say that with confidence? I at least appreciate that, like, he's trying to establish, like, look, I don't want to step on anybody else's toes and try to, like, you know, hijack this particular substance, but, like, it does, all right, what is psilocybes only grow on cows who eat Phalaris arundi? I don't know what that specific Latin term is for that species. Let's definitely give me a follow-up on that one. Oh, grass with DMT. Interesting. Okay. Not sure what to do with that just yet, but I intend on doing more research onto the real deal, especially as the overwhelming cultural consciousness is leading in the direction of legalization, or at least decriminalization. I imagine it's going to become increasingly more relevant. Unfortunately, Wisconsin is one of the few places in the United States where, to my understanding, there is no psilocybe genus magic mushrooms that grow here in any meaningful capacity. The only shit that you can find is really low in psilocybin count and incredibly uncommon. So, like, I'll have to go to fucking Washington or something like that. Man, Wisconsin's so cool, but it also sucks so bad. It's awful. Isn't that crazy? Literally, like, look up a map and you'll find that there's, like, fucking nothing. There's just, like, all of these, like, weird ones to where, like, yeah, Pacific Northwest has a shit ton. They're not, like, exclusive there, but something about, like, it's like a humidity thing where I feel like that's a big aspect. I imagine, like, ocean effect probably contributes as well, because there's, like, a really dense, even in, like, the colder parts of Cascadia, there's, like, a pretty dense swath where you find them there. I am not nearly familiar enough with that kind of stuff to speak in any degree of confidence.
Through this unclaimed vegetable teacher, one can gain entry into the world of the elf chemists. This mushroom is a trans-dimensional doorway which sly fairies have left slightly ajar for anyone to enter into who can find the key and wishes to use this power, the power of vision, to explore this peculiar and naturally occurring psychoactive complex.
For Terence and the mushroom, it was love at first sight. The quest for ukuhe was quickly forgotten as the hippies plumbed deeper into the mysteries of these queer, yellow-capped dung lovers. They began to take heroic doses of psilocybin almost daily. With a fewer variety of food options than they were used to in the States, they started regularly throwing freshly plucked mushrooms into their soups and rice bowls.
You would never have me doing that, right? Like, I can handle daily heroic dose shit where I've done that before, but I've spoken on many occasions, the actual flavor of magic mushrooms is truly one of the most repugnant things I've ever had. I just can't. It is so awful. Simply like being in proximity to one will make me gag. The only way I can get the fuckers down, and again, for whatever feds might be listening, I've not had any actual, like, any legit stuff, if we're going to be weird like the people on the Psychonaut wiki. The only way it can be done for me is you grind it into a fine-ass powder and I add that shit to smoothies. That's the only way. Otherwise, you are not catching me eating it. It's terrible. Like, it makes me want to barf. It's awful. Ugh. Just putting that shit in soup? Like, no shot. I'm doing that. Fuck no.
What could go wrong? Days turned to weeks. Terence began to feel like the group was on the verge of some sort of preternatural contact with...
I've had some taste bad, other neutral, but never great. That's one of those things. Like, there are some people in this community where they talk about, like, oh, I love the flavor. Death sentence. Nope. You need to be behind bars. Like, unacceptable. There is no way that you are a normal human. I refuse to believe that you can be a real person if you like the flavor of this shit. There's a difference between, like, putting up with it and liking it. No fucking shot. Liking it? Are you crazy? Oh... Do you like just... I feel like the only people who like the taste of magic mushrooms are also the kids who had to be told by their parents to stop eating dirt a lot.
Capital O other. During a trip one night, Dennis entered
the shade.
a catatonic state and began involuntarily emitting a loud buzzing sound, giving the distinct impression of a man possessed. When he had snapped out of the trance, he was highly alarmed and excited. He claimed that the sound had generated some sort of physical force. Dennis, Terence, and Ev were utterly convinced that the sound had supernatural origins. Vanessa and Dave were more skeptical. Discussing the experience...
Okay, so I mentioned this, I think in part 2, that, like, sometimes in his newer videos, he'll just, like, add trippy visuals, and I try to watch his videos while tripping. You know, it just synergizes well. I've done several of them. He's caught me doing it, I guess you could say. But, like, when you are tripping and then he starts doing this shit, it makes you freak the fuck out because you're like, bro, what the fuck is up with the visuals right now? He just got way harder, like, way more intense. And no, he's just fucking with it. When I attempted this video reaction the first time while doing the Karma IQ, maybe like a week ago, I thought he was doing that to the carpet in, like, one of the earlier segments, and I was like, bro, what are you doing with the carpet right now? And no, that was just the Karma IQ doing that. Fucks with my head.
During the following days, Terence seized upon some rumors he had once heard that in other parts of the Amazon, shamans on ayahuasca had the ability to vomit a magical substance, which he refers to as a psychofluid, which could be used for purposes of divination.
Me out here sneezing out the psychofluid.
Manifestation of the reality of the psychedelic experience. Perhaps this otherworldly vocalization could achieve the same function if focused directly. Dennis feverishly expounded on the idea in his own journal. On trip to...
So I feel like that's an interesting topic. Obviously, like, it rings of, like, pseudoscience, woo-woo, hippie nonsense. Like, fair, I'll grant you that. But, like, I guess it makes sense with what would have been discussed at the time in the psychedelic community, especially with, like, new age religious practices. This, like, idea of vibrations and the combination of, like, Eastern mantra practices. If you're not familiar, mantras are a repetitious phrase or series of sounds used. Typically, you see them in Buddhism most, but it's also in Hinduism, it's also in Jainism, it's in a bunch of the other trends. And so there's, like, this idea religiously that, like, certain noises, when emanated properly, have some sort of, like, literal universal vibrational energy that you can kind of channel into yourself. So, like, in some Buddhist practices, it is believed that by simply saying a specific mantra frequently will sort of channel the energy of the Buddha or Bodhisattva that the mantra is in accordance with. So when you combo that idea with what's being described here, like a crazy psychic scream from tripping balls is not necessarily, like, that far gone with what was being discussed in this era. Sure, sounds funny, but, you know, Shit, a lot of things sound funny and out of context.
Means it is possible, under special conditions, to hear and vocalize a sound that turns through a higher dimensional manifold and condenses as translinguistic matter, i.e. matter reduplicated upon itself through time, much as a hologram is reduplicated through space. The substance whose appearance the sound initiates is tryptamine, metabolized by mind through a higher spatial dimension. It is a hyperdimensional molecule carrying its trip on the outside of itself in this world. The hyperdimensional nature of this material is such that it is all material, concepts, events, words, people, and ideas, homogenized into one thing via the higher dimensional alchemy of mind.
Eager to test.
Once again, like I tend to operate as like a strict materialist when like in discussions with people who do not share the same sort of metaphysical beliefs. But like even with Buddhism, that idea is not necessarily contradictory. Mantras do quite literally function that way as far as what the cosmology believes. How many people like take it genuinely seriously or analyze it in any meaningful capacity is to be seen, but much as what was described earlier in the early in the video, like a quote about Terence, to where it's like a lot of what he says isn't literally true, but is poetically true. I do feel like that concept is very poetically true on like the nature of, you know, the intersection between psychedelics and religious mystical thinking. It's fun. Just don't like, you know, force other people to believe your increasingly dubious religious beliefs. Have your fun, but, you know, don't be an asshole about it. God, the visuals right now on his face are hilarious. Me on 10 karma IQ.
This theory, stay with me here, Dennis made preparations for what he called the experiment, an attempt to vocalize at a living cubensis mycelium in order to bond their human DNA to the fungus's DNA, uniting them in a higher dimension. And here's where things start to get a little unclear. This would essentially usher in the millennium as the human soul was reunited with its uterine divine source.
Naturally.
According to Terence, Dennis had already used the voice in order to generate a freezing cold wind in the steaming jungle, which had completely convinced him that this...
Yeah, again, it's poetic, right? Like it's from the videos I've seen of Terence, not from this this particular video. Half of it is like a crock of shit, you know, like it's unfounded. It's certainly interesting, and I feel like it could be metaphysically interesting, but like from a strictly rationalist, materialist perspective, sounds like nonsense, but he says it in a fun way. They decided they wanted to mute the video. Okay.
Physics. Dave and Vanessa remained unmoved by this evidence and began to become seriously concerned about the mental health of their companions. On the night of the experiment, March 4th, 1971, there was a sudden and violent thunderstorm. Shouting over the wind, Dennis declared to his companions that it was a sign that they would succeed. Terence here notes that his little brother was beginning to remind him of Captain Ahab. Dave sank to his knees at that moment with a pitiful moan as the rain beat down upon him, like a awestruck Roman centurion prostrating himself before the crucified Christ. Late that night, surrounded by moonless dark, the three true believers, Terence, Dennis, and Ev, brought a mycelium into the hut and gathered around it. They ate mushrooms and drank ayahuasca, then used the voice 3 times. The vocalizations became louder and longer each time, and after the third, there was dead silence, broken only occasionally by the crowing of the cock from the...
I'm very curious as to what it looked like to use the voice. Is it literally just a guy in the tent going, "Oh!" like a horrible moaning wail? Like what does it sound like? I want to hear the voice. Man, don't you just wish that if fucking iPhones were a thing and the Terence McKenna is wandering through the Amazon rainforest? Can you imagine all the crazy shit that would have occurred? We truly live in a society.
Nearby mission. More biblical imagery. Then Dennis leaned forward. "Look," he said breathlessly, and Terence could see a glowing planet in place of where one of the mushrooms had been. "It is our world," Dennis proclaimed. "We have succeeded." Dennis was convinced that he was shamanically initiated. He began to behave like an Old Testament prophet, performing miracles, talking to the dead, including heartbreakingly, their recently deceased mother, and making proclamations as revealed to him by the divine. Recalling the events years later, he says that he felt like he was being stretched across the entire universe. Terence was convinced that the apocalypse was upon them. As he writes,
"The voice of the mushroom spoke in my mind. You've found it. This is it. It's all over now. There is no more. Within a few hours, the superstructure of earthbound human civilization is going to collapse, and your species will depart. First you will go to Jupiter and then to Alpha in Sagittarius. A day of high adventure dawns at last for human beings."
after the experiment, even Ev began to grow distant from the brothers. Most of the party was now convinced that one or both of the McKennas had suffered a psychotic break, and a serious crisis was on their hands. Days later, Dennis was only marginally recovered from his state of religious ecstasy. Terence stopped sleeping so he could watch over his little brother.
Yeah, I've had some crazy crazy trip binges in the past, but I don't think it's ever gotten to that level. It's one of those, like, how would you even, like, quantify how much that they would have been taking? You know, like, how, I don't even think that they know particularly what the potency of what they were working with was. Like, how would you even guess in retrospect? Hello, new person in the chat. We are continuing the reaction series to Atun Shei Films, The Psychedelic Apocalypticism of Terence McKenna. We are currently hearing the story of when Terence lost his shit in the Amazon. Yeah, religious ecstasy.
He didn't sleep for 9 days. According to
9 days. Fucking goddamn. What? What? The most I've made it without sleep was in a pretty bad insomnia bout a few years back, and I think it was like 3.5 days. How do you not sleep for 9 days, like, physiologically? That seems fucked. Typically, after, like, on the come down of a trip, at pretty much any dose is like the best time for me to get sleep. So what?
Dennis, at this point, Vanessa and Dave were begging Terence to call in a float plane and get Dennis first home to America and then to a psychiatric hospital. But Terence held them off. It's okay, he tried to assure them. Let's just see how this plays out. Dennis continued to perform miracles.
Yeah, 9 days is truly baffling. It's one of those, like, I don't want to, like, outright be suspicious, but it almost comes off as, like, how fucked on shrooms are you guys? Like, are you confident that you knew what a day was? Because that just seems physiologically challenging. I've heard of people staying up that long, but, like, typically that requires extensive, like, there's, like, this one guy who went viral a little while back. My sense of time is fucked. Where he was, like, trying to do a stay up as long as he can to beat the world record challenge, and it was, like, a big viral moment. And, like, that required a fuckload of people to be there with him to keep the dude awake. 9 days. What is that in hours? Fucking Jesus. Gotta do basic math here. 216 hours. No, what? Like, I don't know about that one.
One day he quoted word for word a conversation Terence had had with a friend in Nepal that he was not present for. On another, he produced a long-lost key to a lockbox that once belonged to their grandfather. Terence and Ev started seeing strange aerial phenomena. Inky black clouds took the shape of mushrooms, and one gray dawn, a flying saucer pulsing with orange and blue light flew low over the river. This sighting seemed especially significant, since both Dennis and Terence had earlier reported seeing visions of alien starships and feeling like they were being watched from something floating in Earth's orbit.
Okay, so real talk, this one's gonna sound schizo out of nowhere. Within the last month, I've seen two things to where, like, I would describe them as a UFO. I'm not saying that this is, like, aliens or shit, but, like, I live in rural bumfuck nowhere. The only people who fly around here are in basic general aviation. And if you're not familiar with aviation, in order to legally fly jack shit, it has to, like, have very particular colored light markings. So, like, could this have been a drone? Potentially, but the shit moved in a really weird way. But the funny part is both times I saw this, and it was on the same road, very close to my home, but, like, at different stretches of it, This was at like fucking midnight, and it did like some crazy where it like moved in a very unusual fast speed. All I'm saying, I think Terence sent the aliens to kill me.
Directly above the Amazon. Finally, on March 15th, thanks largely to Vanessa's frantic efforts, a float plane arrived to pick the hippies up from La Chorrera. During the journey north to Bogota, Dennis was quiet and seemed weakened. Sobriety slowly but surely reasserted itself. The world had not ended. Yet. The relationships of the party were strained. It seemed like everyone but Terence just wanted to put the whole surreal experience behind them. Back in Berkeley the following month, Terence found himself in a grip of creative mania as he attempted to make sense of what had happened to them. Deciding that he needed expert help, he made an appointment to see Dr. Gunther Stent, a molecular geneticist and professor at Berkeley. Sitting down in the renowned scientist's office, Terence laid out the ideas behind the experiment at La Chorrera. As his diatribe veered into all its bizarre dimensions, Terence sensed that Stent was, quote, calculating the odds of whether I would physically attack him.
Fair. Yeah, fair. I've definitely had some of my bouts of heroic doses produce days of like mania afterward. I don't think to that extent though.
Finally, Terence asked him point blank, do these theories have any validity, or is it simply fallacious? Stent rose from the desk and sat by Terence. With a sigh of resignation, he said, my dear young friend, these ideas are not even fallacious. So what happened at La Chorrera? Were all these wonders simply the result of 5 hippies tripping balls? Well, the short answer is yes. For the long answer, here's Dennis McKenna himself in a podcast interview from 2023.
Most of the information that was transmitted to us in this prolonged altered state, you know, subsequently, and especially from the perspective of now, like, you know, I'm 73, right? So 53 years later, I understand that most of this was bunk, you know. I mean, there were a few flashes of insight, but not at the time, you know. We had various expectations about what the results of that experiment were going to look like, what the outcome was supposed to look like. None of that happened because it couldn't happen. It would have violated every law, every known law of physics.
Well, that just sounds like quitter talk. The best stuff is the stuff that violates the laws of physics.
And collapse the space-time continuum in the process. Space-time continuum proved to be quite resilient. We, not so much. And in fact, you know, we both underwent prolonged, what some people would say was a psychosis.
Yeah, I want Jupiter too. Man, why can't we break the laws of physics? Yeah, well, the laws of physics are just them trying to convince you that the Earth isn't flat. Checkmate, globalists.
And it certainly had elements of that. It had elements of alien abduction experiences, and it had elements of shamanic initiation.
Partially inspired by the...
Can you imagine how funny that would be conceptually? Right, so like, we're working under the assumption that like alien abductions happen, which is already kind of like... but so let's say that they do indeed happen. How hilarious would it be if they're tripping balls in the Amazon rainforest, but then they also happen to coincidentally also be abducted by aliens, and those are like unrelated events, but then like it became like this synergized concept? Can you imagine?
The experiences at La Chorrera, Dennis pursued a career in botanical sciences and is today a noted ethnopharmacologist. While Terence never quite gave up the dream that something of enormous cosmic importance had occurred there in the Colombian jungle in March 1971, Dennis now credits a more psychological and interpersonal explanation. 2 young brothers, devastated by their mother's recent death, both with lifelong interests in science fiction and inspired by their father's penchant for Fate magazine, a pulp periodical from the 50s which ran stories about ghosts, aliens, and strange, unexpected phenomena, including, incidentally, one issue which spotlighted the mushroom cults of Latin America. In short, the McKennas went into the Amazon rainforest, a place that is not exactly known to be kind to the mental health of outsiders, ingested an ungodly
Just
amount
straight
of
vibing
psilocybin
with the
over
flute.
an insanely long period of time, and saw what they wanted to see. But while the mushroom-crazed shamanic initiation of these reckless young hippies makes for a rip-roaring tale, it is a mere footnote in terms of the La Chorrera expedition's historical importance, because the McKennas returned to the United States with the spores of Psilocybe cubensis, and over the following 4 years, they would attempt to cultivate the fungus in artificial conditions. It was arduous work, and progress was slow, but one day...
Yeah, imagine being the first people to, like, cultivate that shit outside of, the, you know, it just occurring in nature. That had to have been so challenging. Like, the process is already pretty, like, weird. From the brief amount of time I've spent reading into it, you got to get a lot of variables right to get a good harvest, right? Like, a lot of people can, like, grow shit stuff and in small quantities, but to, like, optimize it is apparently quite challenging, especially with wacky strains. So to be that kind of pioneer is kind of cool from, like, a botanist perspective, I guess you could say.
In 1975, Terence returned to his house from a walk and absent-mindedly decided to check in on some neglected mushroom tubs in his greenhouse. He opened the door and, quote,
There they were, by the dozens, by the hundreds, huge picture-perfect specimens of psilocybe. I was neck-deep in alchemical gold. The elf legions of hyperspace had ridden to my rescue again. I was saved. As I knelt to examine specimen after perfect specimen, tears of joy streamed down my face. Then I knew the compact was still unbroken. The greatest adventure still lay ahead.
Terence and Dennis anonymously co-authored a book the following year called The Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, which gave step-by-step details for how cubensis fungi could be cultivated at home.
Okay, so they anonymously wrote it, but then they're going to have foreword by Terence McKenna. Bro, what? Like, that seems inadvisable.
Knowledge of the magic mushroom exploded across the English-speaking world. Hitching a ride on its human symbiote, Psilocybe cubensis spread out from the equator to thrive clandestinely in closets and garages all over the developed world, and became the common entheogen we know and love today. The United States government has idiotically classified fungi of the Psilocybe genus as a Schedule I drug, meaning that in most municipalities of this fair land, possession of any quantity of these mushrooms can land you in prison for years.
God bless America, definitely looking out for the health and safety of its citizens. Hey, you want to go get a beer after this?
This is despite the fact that many Psilocybe species, including cubensis, naturally occur in biomes across the country. Interestingly, the possession of cubensis spores, which contain no psilocybin, is legal in every state except California, Idaho, and Georgia. There are lots of reputable spore companies where you can actually order spores online for microscopy purposes, or really any purpose you want other than inoculating grain spawn. Now,
as they say, the ideal thing that people will say on even the mystery magic mushroom packages, it's for religious or scientific research purposes.
Viewed soberly, it's easy to laugh and dismiss the McKenna's exploits as drugged up nonsense. And sure, when heard second or third hand, it seems like gibberish. But the lived experience of psychedelia is harder to dismiss. Clearly, these compounds are powerful and meaningful and impart genuine spiritual significance to many people. It seems to me that the McKennas definitely suffered from mental health issues at La Chorrera, and the ability of psychedelics to, in rare instances, trigger serious psychotic events is well attested. But the critical factor here was that these hippies were taking psilocybin extremely irresponsibly. They were like kids playing with their father's gun, dangerously overindulging in mushrooms and ayahuasca at an extremely emotionally fraught period in their lives.
I'm the wrath of God. Who else is with me?
But using entheogens
The
to
monkey.
achieve shamanic ecstasy, which I believe the party genuinely did, is nothing to wave your finger at. It's a practice that may be as old or older than our species. In fact, it may have inspired the very idea of human spirituality itself.
All right, so that will conclude this segment. So this was episode 4. I think we'll probably jump into doing more immediately, but I feel like that's the obvious cutoff point. I'm going to have a lot of commentary to say about the next segment because it gets into a lot more of like the, like socio-political subjects of the matter and some of the outcomes of that. But with that in mind, look forward to me slowly uploading subsequent episodes. We'll jump right into part 5 then. Jesus, I managed to drag this one on for a hot minute.